New Hampshire. Howdy doody for the final video of the weird folklore, cryptids, and ghost stories trifecta. Also, don't worry, I'll be back for more in due time. This is just goodbye for now. Well, that is unless one of your faceless monsters drags me down into a lake. Then it's probably a permanent goodbye. But I don't think that'll happen. So today we're going to be talking about the strange creatures that supposedly live in your woods. From tall, lanky, and hairy creatures that live in your woods and enjoy watching humans while hiding behind trees, to faceless creatures that live below your lakes. Either way you slice it, there are some strange, if a little bit creepy creatures that call your state home. Now, quickly, before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you for stopping by and let you know, if you decide you like this video, it would mean a whole lot to me if you liked, subscribed, and commented your favorite cryptid down below. And also, you can hype this video. I don't really know what that does, but I think it pushes me out there to the rest of YouTube. None of this will ever cost you a dime, and it tells YouTube, hey, this guy's alright. With that being said, come with me today, and let's explore the strange creatures that supposedly live in New Hampshire. If you've watched my other videos, knowing myself, I've probably said that some weird state-specific variety of Bigfoot is my favorite variety, but do not believe that other T's story time, because during the 3 to 5% of the time that my brain is actually functioning, if someone asks me, T, what's your favorite Bigfoot variant? I will always answer, the New Hampshire Wood Devil. This isn't to discriminate either, don't smack me with a lawsuit in cryptid court, it's just personal preference, and I personally find the Wood Devil to be unapologetically creepy in its portrayal, and also very subtle, which adds to its believability. When you look through the long list of Bigfoot variants across the country, most are just the standard Pacific Northwest Bigfoot with a different name. Sometimes they're given wild powers, like invisibility, or burrowing into the ground at lightning speed. Fun stuff, sure, but the Wood Devil sets itself apart by being simply creepy. The Wood Devil is very similar to Bigfoot. It's got big feet, it's 7 to 9 feet tall, it's covered in brown hair, but beyond that, it feels almost like a crossbreed. See, the Wood Devil it's tall and skinny, not stocky like Bigfoot. And it uses that to its advantage. Like the hide-behinds of Appalachian folklore, it's said to watch you, until you glance its way, of course, and then it darts behind a tree, turning sideways so you can't see it. And if there's no tree, it supposedly freezes in place to blend in, which is exactly what I do when someone waves at me and I'm not sure if it's at me. To be clear though, it doesn't sound like it's hunting humans, it just watches you when it stumbles across you. Further, it differentiates itself from a typical Bigfoot, in that many say this Wood Devil has a long, almost horse-like head sticking out from an otherwise ape-like skull. Unlike Bigfoot, though, the Wood Devil is considered a scavenger. It supposedly eats roadkill, garbage, and small animals like rabbits and squirrels. So basically it's a college freshman, and when it finds a big enough food source for several of its kind, that's when people say you'll hear its horrible screams or howls that carry on for miles that are supposedly used to summon other wood devils to an abundant food source. And as for where it lives, the stories place it almost exclusively in Coos County, New Hampshire, which I've seen some places as Coos County, New Hampshire. So is it Coos or Coos? Let me know. So anyways, that's what the creature is, and how it differs from Bigfoot. But I also wanted to know if this legend actually predates the internet, or if it was born on some forum like The Rake. And the answer to that, at least in my sleuthing, is that it's sort of split. On one hand, there are a lot of forums where locals note that they'd never actually heard of the Wood Devil while they were growing up in Coos County, and they'd only heard about it online. But if you dig a little bit into pre-2005 sources, you'll find a 2001 submission to the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization describing a sighting from 1990. In this sighting, 2 brothers were canoeing on Lake George in New York. I know, not New Hampshire, but pretty close. And it was around sunset near a cliff called Deer Leap. And here they saw a tall, brown figure standing straight up with its arms at its side that was pretty skinny, facing the shoreline. As they passed it, it slowly turned its head to look at them. They described this tall creature as sort of looking like a giant lemur, even saying it looked like it was sort of smiling. And when they got further away in their canoe, it climbed like a sloth into a tree and positioned itself so perfectly that according to them it would have been invisible if they hadn't already spotted it. During this whole encounter, they noted they didn't feel threatened or anything, but like there was kind of an invisible line in the sand at some point between them and this creature that, if they crossed it, would put them in immediate danger, sort of like that awkward Thanksgiving you might have attended where there was a family-only table. The witnesses later suggested it was a wood devil, or maybe a stick man after doing a bit of research. This post is actually where that odd depiction of the wood devil originated that I'm showing on screen here, probably the most famous one associated with those in New Hampshire. Investigators followed it up too. For instance, the brother of the main witness, who was also there, told the same story, albeit they mentioned that he told it with fewer details, which is a little bit suspicious. And locals shared another report from a YMCA lifeguard who saw a, quote, a monkey boy that was hopping on and off a stone wall near this lake just 2 years after this incident occurred. There are also other scattered references to similar creatures online, some hinting at even older tellings of some sort of tall, lanky variety of Bigfoot in Coos County. So as for my take, I think this legend actually does predate the internet, and it might even be a fearsome critter would be my guess. If you don't know, these critters were creatures that loggers of old used to tell stories about around their campfires in the 18 and 1900s. They were beasts that were said to live just beyond the firelight, always watching and always waiting and always a little ridiculous. If I had to guess, that's probably where the wood devil legend comes from. But who knows? Maybe it's real. And with this in mind, the wood devil isn't the only New Hampshire Bigfoot you'll hear about. Reports of large, hairy creatures are scattered everywhere, from Franconia Notch and the White Mountains to even popular hiking spots like Mount Monadnock and sometimes even Nashua. Take, for instance, the so-called flea monster that was seen in Hollis, New Hampshire in 1977. This story tells of a family from Lowell, Massachusetts, who actually drove up with their trailer, planning to sleep overnight outside of the flea market before a busy morning ensued. This night, though, their truck and trailer started shaking. Thinking it was a burglar, the husband went outside, only to see an 8 or 9 foot tall hairy figure rocking the truck. Of course, when he flicked his headlights on, it did bolt, leaving over a 4-foot fence and staring back at him for several minutes before walking away. The family, of course, reported this beast to the Hollis police, but the officers found no tracks thanks to a thick layer of pine needles covering the ground. The police figured it was a bear in the end, and later the man reported it to the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. To be fair, though, what are the police even supposed to do about a Bigfoot? Read it Miranda rights and hope it doesn't eat the squad car? And then there's another notable sighting known as the Ossipee Mountain Sasquatch. This sighting takes place in the summer of 1979, and it involves a man named Peter Samuelson, a 65-year-old local of Fryeburg, Maine, who visited the mountains with his dog and girlfriend. They came out to this area to prospect in the Ossipee Range this evening, looking for crystals specifically. This weekend, they would park in the Gilman Valley Road area, parking at the gate, and walking up the road past the Tamworth and Ossipee town line, then cutting into the woods and going up Bald Mountain for about 2 miles. Up here, they thought they'd have a good chance of finding crystals. But then, as Connor Pond became visible at a tree break, below them to their left, they saw something about 100 yards ahead on a ledge. At first, this thing wasn't a beast. Rather, they saw a stone structure, a dwelling of sorts, but one made out of impossibly large stones that, up here, would have had to have been moved by hands or primitive tools. There was no heavy machinery getting up this way. The roof, they said, was flat, and it was made of hatched hemlock boughs, and there was an opening, a doorway, which they stared in, and suddenly saw a giant man-like creature they thought was about 7 feet tall, covered with tangled gray hair. Their dog, of course, did what dogs do, and he started growling and barking at the creature, which suddenly noticed them and began to make, I quote, loud noises, which scared the couple, and they got out of there with haste, forgetting to even take photographs with the cameras they brought with them, because of course they did. Nothing terrifies people more than operating a camera when it actually matters. Regardless, years later, Peter actually returned to this site on his own, but he couldn't find any evidence of the shelter they'd seen before. So, to put it simply, these stories are everywhere in New Hampshire, and I think I've actually seen more Bigfoot-adjacent sightings here in New Hampshire than in any other state I've covered. Heck, if folks wanted, I could probably make a 2-hour video on its own of the various Bigfoot evidence found in New Hampshire, and while it probably isn't all going to convince me of Foot's existence, it's probably more convincing than the story of the Hoboken Monkey Man, at least. Recently, folks have been saying they've really enjoyed stories of aquatic cryptids I've been putting out there. And that's exciting, because even though New Hampshire has the least coastline of any coastal state in the USA, it basically has a Dunkin' parking lot with a view of the ocean, that doesn't mean it doesn't have plenty of lakes to hide secrets underneath instead. This story takes place at Dublin Lake in New Hampshire, a clear spring-fed lake nestled at the base of Mount Monadnock, surrounded by forest hills and scenic views. It's a quiet spot, popular for swimming, paddling, and fishing, with a peaceful, if unspoiled atmosphere. That is, unless you believe the stories. See, while conventional wisdom says that this lake is solely home to comic aquatic species like brook trout, smallmouth bass, and hornpout, there are a couple of tales floating around that say otherwise. See, a popular activity at Dublin Lake, believe it or not, is scuba diving. Underwater here, there are quite a few fish to see, and there are quite a few neat underwater rock formations too. But the legend goes, at the deepest portion of this lake, there's something else entirely, a series of caverns in which something more fantastical lurks. This legend pretty much always starts with some variety of diving accident. In the most common legend, it's a free diving accident. They say that a couple of divers dropped a weighted rope to the deepest portion of Dublin Lake, resting just around 100 feet in depth, and a free diver followed this rope all the way to the bottom. But he found that when he got there was some sort of chasm, and his friend would say that he went inside. Now, of course, his friend was freediving too, and he didn't have that much air, so he surfaced and waited a few minutes for his friend, and realized, after those few minutes were up, something horrible must have gone wrong. So, of course, he alerted authorities, but they found nothing. See, when a team of scuba divers went down after the man, they didn't find him nor the chasm by the rope. They were all gone. With this in mind, they thought the man had passed away in the depths of the lake. That is, until about 2 days later, when some hikers actually found this man in the nude, walking through the woods in the forest around Dublin Lake, mumbling kind of incoherently about some sort of monster he saw in the lake's caverns, which is the exact opposite of what you'd want to see in a wholesome nature walk. Regardless, once he got his composure, he knew he'd seen a monster, but he was unable to describe it, nor was he able to tell the people that found him how he got back to the surface. The only detail we get from this saga that supposedly took place in the 1980s is that this version of the creature was something akin to an eel, which means it's not outside of the realm of possibility that he saw a mud-stained pool noodle at the bottom of a lake. Now, there's also another similar version of this tale that involves a scuba diver lowering himself to the depths of Dublin Lake in a diving bell. But when he got there, again, there was a chasm, and of course he'd suit up in his diving gear and go explore this chasm. But, of course, as you might expect, hours later his buddies would remark that he'd never returned. And again, he'd be found a few days later, wandering naked again in the woods. In this version, though, it splits from the other, in that rather than coming face to face with some aquatic cryptid, he would actually find air pockets below the lake, in which he'd encounter some sort of subterranean but non-aquatic cryptid, that, again, he was unable to fully describe. So my guess is it was probably something between a naked mole rat and Danny DeVito from those Jimmy John commercials, where he lives in the walls. Going on, though, there are, well, a lot of takes on what this creature looks like online, given the lack of a description, but as I'm sure I've shared already, this is my interpretation of the creature. In both accounts, though, it's some sort of short-term insanity that prevents our protagonist from being able to remember what the creature they encountered looked like. Further, I think it's worth noting, there's a sort of adjacent but scarcely documented story about some sort of UFO that was also observed over this lake in the 1980s that supposedly crashed in it. And when scuba divers went down to investigate this craft, they found its hatch was open, but outside of it was some sort of creature that before their eyes appeared to be drowning, and then afterwards became some sort of rock at the bottom of the lake. In the stories, the authorities, with their black vans and such, closed down the border of the lake, and of course removed the craft. But as the legend goes, this alien body that took the form of a stone at the bottom of the lake remains there to this day, glossed over by who I can only assume were the men in black. So congratulations, New Hampshire, you might be the only state where people skip stones that used to be extraterrestrials. So anyways, if you decide to go practice some scuba in Dublin Lake, do Tease Storytime a favor. Do so with a reputable instructor, and for the love of God, don't decide to cave dive on a whim if you see a chasm at the bottom. So I thought I'd do something a little bit different for this round of cryptid videos, and include a creature that everyone knows exists, but in New Hampshire is considered a cryptid because, according to the state's fish and game experts, they supposedly no longer live here. It's kind of like the Black Panther sightings you hear about all across the southern USA, which might just be wet mountain lions and bad lighting. Anyways, the claims go like this. Instead of the usual coyote sightings in the region, people sometimes report much larger canids roaming around. For example, back in December of 2014, hunter Denise Noel, who lives near Big Pea Porridge Pond, that's a bunch of peas, around Madison and Conway County line, said she and her daughter saw a gigantic gray or black wolf just walking down the street like it was on its way to Hannaford's. Around the same time, there were also reports of missing pets in the area. To be fair, fish and game biologist Pat Tate admitted that while it was unlikely, it was certainly possible that the animal she saw could have been a wolf or a wolf hybrid, which admittedly might be how a biologist says, I don't want to say wolf because then I'll have 50 calls about a werewolf before dinner time. But still, the missing dogs were small, so he believed a coyote was the more likely culprit. Noelle, however, stuck to her guns, saying she knew the difference between a wolf and a coyote. There was also a post last December on Chester, New Hampshire's Facebook page, which, okay, I know, don't rag on Facebook local gossip groups too much, even if they will declare war on a mailbox if it looks suspicious, but they were absolutely convinced there was a wolf wandering in the woods. Beyond that, forums dedicated to weird sightings in New Hampshire are full of people swearing up and down that the dog they spotted in the woods was way too big to be a coyote. The thing is, though, the photos and evidence they share, usually paw prints, almost always turns out to be coyotes. A good rule of thumb, though, if the prints fit in the palm of your hand, it's a coyote. Wolves, on the other hand, they have big dog paws. Still, it's not exactly outlandish to think that wolves could very well be in New Hampshire. Sure, the last officially documented wolf in the state was in 1895, but wolves don't need passports to cross the Canadian border. Historically, their disappearance wasn't a mystery either. As far back as the 1600s, the colonial government was putting bounties on wolves, seeing them as threats to livestock and settlements. And over the next 2 centuries, the pressure from hunting and trapping and shrinking habitats wiped them out across most of New England. By the late 1800s, they were functionally gone from New Hampshire, hanging on just a little bit longer in northern Maine before vanishing from the region almost entirely. Suddenly, what used to be an apex predator in the forests were reduced to legend, replaced over time by the smaller, more adaptable coyotes. Basically the raccoons of the dog world, loud, scrappy, and way too comfortable eating your trash. Now, despite this supposed disappearance, there are still quite a few wolves in New England's vicinity. In fact, wolves have been seen, often even, within 20 miles of the New Hampshire border in the last couple decades. And in northern Quebec, there are known to be about 7,000 wolves, with large packs living only a couple of hundred miles from New Hampshire. So yes, it's absolutely plausible they could wander south. And we've seen the same thing happen with mountain lions turning up in southern states where they weren't thought to exist in breeding populations. And also, it bears noting, wolves are making a comeback in the US. They are slowly reclaiming habitats they were once wiped out of in the 1800s. For instance, in 1993, a wolf was killed in northern Maine, and in 2003, another was killed in New York State. So it feels less like a question of if wolves will be in New Hampshire again, and more like when, if they aren't there already. There's also another possible explanation I saw. In Leinster in 2006, there were rumors that a sanctuary that kept wolf hybrids had one escape. Now, I couldn't find any hard documentation of that, just old forum chatter and Reddit posts, but it's been floated as a possibility. Officially, though, the stance hasn't changed. Wolves, according to the government, haven't lived in New Hampshire since 1895, their populations collapsing after centuries of pressure. That said, it is possible, so it's up to y'all now. Do you think you've seen a wolf in New Hampshire? You know where to let me know. December 15th of 1956 was supposed to be a normal day for Alfred Holm, a man in his 70s living in Derry, New Hampshire. Alfred was just doing what any self-respecting New Hampshire man would have done in the 1950s around Christmas. He was harvesting a Christmas tree for his family. So there he was, trudging through the woods on his 8 acres of land, when suddenly he felt the hair on the back of his neck kind of stand up. You know that feeling like someone's watching you? Well, he felt that. So Alfred did what any sensible person would do in the middle of nowhere in the dead of winter. He looked around and surveyed the snowy forest. And that's, of course, when he saw it. A small creature, about 2 feet tall, that was just kind of staring at him. Now, if this was a Hollywood movie, Alfred would have screamed and run for his life. But no, he didn't. Instead, he froze and he stared back. This wasn't just a creature you'd typically see in the woods of New Hampshire either. According to Alfred, it wasn't a moose, he didn't think, or a beaver, or even a better-known cryptid like a wood devil. Rather, it had green, wrinkled skin, like an elephant's skin, he said. Also, despite the fact that it was, standing on two legs, it wasn't quite human. And it also wasn't quite animal. It was something else entirely. It had stubby arms and stubby legs, and according to him, basset hound-like ears that flopped around like they were too big for its little head. And the eyes, they had a protective film over them. So Alfred, he did what any reasonable person would do when faced with an alien-looking thing in the woods. He watched it for 20 minutes and didn't move a muscle. And the fact that he was able to watch it for 20 minutes, he said, kind of in a weird way, it was like the creature wanted to be seen, but also wasn't so sure it should be. Now at this point, you might think Alfred would run back home and tell everyone, "I saw an alien! Someone get the camera!" But no, Alfred, being the practical man he was, thought about the consequences. Nobody would believe him, he probably thought. So he did the one thing that made sense. He decided he would try to capture it. I'm guessing Alfred played Pokemon or did something else to gain a lot of confidence in his ability to toss a burlap sack over this little dude, because according to Alfred, he'd open up this bag wide and stealthily, slowly approach this strange little creature, and once he was close enough, he lunged at it, throwing the bag over its saggy little head. That said, the creature didn't go down without a fight, and this little Pokemon used the move Supersonic. As Alfred lunged, the little beast let out an ear-piercing scream. It was so loud that Alfred swore it hurt his ears and disoriented him. Alfred was confused by its move, and then rather than being able to pursue the creature, he hurt himself in his confusion. The creature, of course, took this opportunity to flee from the encounter, like that shiny legendary you've been looking for years in Soul Silver. Despite this, if I were a 2-foot-tall gnome, I'd probably also scream and run if some old guy in a flannel shirt suddenly tried to capture me in a sack. Anyway, in the aftermath of this incident, Alfred didn't tell anyone locally, according to him because, I quote, "I didn't want to be the crazy old man who saw a little green alien in the woods." So instead, he just went home and sort of kept quiet about it. If he had told anyone, you know how it would have gone. "Yeah, sure, Alfred, you saw a little green man with floppy ears, and I saw Bigfoot getting jiggy with the Loch Ness Monster last week." Eventually, though, Alfred would tell someone, a man named Walter Webb, a guy who used to work at the Charles Hayden Planetarium in Boston. Also, fun fact, Webb was the same guy who first investigated the famous Betty and Barney Hill UFO encounter. Alfred, perhaps because he knew Walter had been involved in the Betty and Barney Hill case, personally reached out to Walter about this little creature he saw, framing it as an LGM or Little Green Man report. And at least in terms of lore from New Hampshire, that's pretty much where this story ends. But the plot does thicken a bit if you look over state borders. While you might think Alfred's creature was one of a kind, not really. You see, in 1981, Fate magazine, admittedly a magazine known for its sensationalized articles and occasional hoaxes, published a story about a very similar creature spotted in Arnold, Pennsylvania by a handful of teenagers. It was small, it had floppy ears, it had wrinkled green skin, and it was described in a way that could have been a distant cousin of Alfred's little Christmas tree monster. The story basically said these teens came across the little creature, who upon being noticed, let out an ear-piercing scream before running away. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? So anyways, what could this have been? Well, in terms of supernatural explanations, if I believed in such thing, I'd firmly be in the camp of calling this a Pukwudgie. Little man in the woods of New England, that's pretty much your go-to answer. And we'll talk more about this little guy in a second, too. That said, a lot of folks I saw on YouTube, which, isn't exactly peer-reviewed literature, put out the speculative take that this, it could have been a gnome or a goblin. Yep, they said that. Citing that the large eyes and floppy ears might be indicative of a creature that spends a lot of time underground. Admittedly, while I'm not sure about these sorts of things existing in the first place, I did find it pretty fun for the first time in my research for this channel to come across people who were convinced of the existence of gnomes, so that's cool. Of course, in terms of possible realistic explanations, there are a few of these that make sense. Now, I'll be the first to admit, it's tough to find something that fits the description of 2 feet tall with large eyes, floppy ears, and standing on 2 legs. But it's pretty easy to find creatures that have 1 or 2 of these traits. For instance, I'm not sure if I'll be able to find any photos of a featherless owl that are in the Creative Commons that I can share, but look one up if you can. They have big eyes, and they look downright alien. More chicken nugget than chicken, if you catch my drift. Further, I know this is something that's parroted a lot, but a fledgling moose, lacking a bit of fur and standing on its hind legs, would have floppy ears, droopy skin, and be, okay, a bit larger than 2 feet, but not too much larger. As for my next best guest, though, Master Yoda is probably up there too in the rankings. I mean, think about it. He has floppy skin, big ears, and big eyes, so he matches the description pretty much perfectly. As always, though, when I'm confused, I like to outsource guesses as to what this could be, so I'd love to hear your feedback on whether this creature was all hoax, real, or possibly Master Yoda. Danville is a quiet town. For instance, I knew a woman from Danville once. She left and she moved to Boston, which is where I met her, and she had 3 hometown friends living in Boston too. If you catch what I mean, my impression is that Danville's main export is people in their 20s. Further, I get the impression it's this kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary happens. Well, that is, until it does. In the fall of 2001, Danville's quiet was shattered. It started as these things often do, with a howl. First one, and then a few more. People began hearing strange, unsettling howls and barking noises at night. These sounds echoed through the woods and over the hills, but no one really knew what was making them. All they knew was these howls sounded more like something you'd hear in a nature documentary about the Amazon rainforest than in their New Hampshire backyards. Then, one chilly morning in September, Danville's fire chief, Dave Kimball, reported something that would assign a possible face to these noises. He said he saw, I quote, a reddish-brown coated primate that was about 2 feet tall with razor-sharp claws and wearing a dog-like muzzle on the streets of Danville just before dawn. It was near Pleasant Street and Kingston Road. Kimball watched as the creature hopped into the middle of the street and jumped around a bit before suddenly lunging off into the woods when it noticed his vehicle. Kimball, of course, though, being a man of logic, did what any reasonable person would do. He went home, and instead of calling animal control, he called David Attenborough, and he watched a bunch of nature documentaries, trying to figure out what he'd just seen. And he landed on this creature being a Humboldt's woolly monkey, a species that is, of course, native to the Amazon rainforest. Now, at first, Kimball kept this to himself, telling only a few close friends. But you know how that goes. You tell your friend you saw a monkey, and then your friend tells his friend that his buddy saw a monkey. And the next thing you know, your uncle's calling NBC News to tell them there's a monkey in your small town in New Hampshire. As the rumor spread, these sightings of the monkey of course increased with them. In the 2 weeks following Kimball's sightings, there were 9 more reports of the same creature. It was seen near trees, in yards, and most unsettlingly, on a few rooftops. The whispers of a monkey in Danville continued to grow, and there was even a little boy living in the region who had a treehouse in his backyard, and he noted that he'd been keeping little peanut butter cookies in his treehouse for years, but recently they'd been going missing. He, of course, blamed the monkey. Also, let's once again highlight that escaped monkeys and children are, without fail, always allies to one another, and I think that's awesome. The hysteria, of course, hit its peak on September 9th, when for some reason, search parties literally went out into the woods to search for a monkey, who by now had gained a reputation as dangerous and potentially demonic, losing its initial description as a 2-foot-tall monkey and gaining one as a 9-foot-tall, I quote, devil monkey with sharp teeth and razor-like claws that it used to aggressively swing tree to tree. As for more credible sightings, though, there were a few of those too. An animal control officer, for instance, went out to search for the creature and actually managed to come across it. To their credit, they didn't say this was a devil monkey, though, but was rather, I quote, a very normal monkey. Rumors also swirled about where this monkey came from, ranging from folks saying it was an escaped research facility monkey to someone's pet. But admittedly, nobody ever came forward to claim it was their monkey. Funny as it is too, locally, livestock started going missing around this time, mostly chickens, goats, and a few small pigs. And of course, people blamed the monkey, which, admittedly, I don't know how a small monkey kills goats or pigs, but it became a panic. And there are accounts that some parents refused to even let their children go out after sunset, and the idea of canceling school was even floated at a PTA meeting. I love a good overreaction, and this definitely was one. At one point, the town literally even brought in a female monkey to try to lure the creature out. They brought it to Danville and did whatever you could do to get a female monkey, quote-unquote, in the mood to mate. However, as you can imagine, the female monkey wasn't exactly cooperative with this, and she didn't make a single noise. Sadly, the catfish your Tinder date approach didn't work either, so the creature remained elusive. And here comes the climax of this saga. Admittedly, the monkey wasn't caught. But on September 11th of 2001, a date that was significant for other reasons, NBC's Today Show literally came to Danville to do an interview about Danville's monkey crisis. But as you might expect, other events happened that day that completely overshadowed the monkey business, and the NBC staff left about as fast as they arrived. After this, with the attention of the local community and nation being drawn elsewhere, panic over this rogue monkey waned. People went back to their normal lives, the searches stopped, and the reports of howling at night slowly disappeared. There was a claim about 10 years later in 2011 of a monkey being seen in the woods around Danville again, but this report was brief and never came with a follow-up. Otherwise, from what I can tell, the Danville Devil Monkey was never seen again. Regardless, the legend of the Devil Monkey, as it came to be called, lives on in Danville. Recently, for instance, one local resident even took it upon themselves to create AI renderings of the creature, plastering them around town because nothing says timeless legend like mid-journey vomit taped to a telephone pole. But hey, I guess it's cool that if you're hiking near Danville today, you might just catch a glimpse of this little Easter egg that is their Devil Monkey. And as for the original witness of the monkey, well, Kimball passed away in 2015, but he never wavered in his belief. He stood by his story of seeing this monkey until the very end. As for the monkey though, well, that remains a mystery, but maybe, just maybe, he's still out there, hiding in the woods. Or maybe more plausibly, someone in the next decade or so is going to come across the skeleton of a monkey along one of these hiking trails, just in time for spooky season. So, to be clear, this one's a carryover from our Haunted Places video on New Hampshire, but I think it's fair to include in both videos, frankly, because it involves tiny little critters that, in one interpretation, could be demon-like creatures, but in another might very well be Pukwudgies. This is the story of the strange little critters that supposedly call Vale Cemetery in Wilton, New Hampshire home. Vale Cemetery came to be in 1772, when the town voted to fence in the old burying ground, but the oldest grave on site comes from even earlier, and is known to be one of a lady named Phoebe Cram, and the graveyard was upgraded in the coming years, in 1780 getting a stone wall, expanding in 1869 with the donation of more land, and eventually in 1871 it got its name it has today, Vale Cemetery. Now, as for the haunted stories that supposedly call this cemetery home, they date back to the 1970s, and the individual blamed for the haunting in this account is one Mary Ritter Spalding, a woman who actually passed away at age 35, and was actually buried here a long time before in 1808. She was the second wife of one Captain Isaac Spalding, and in death she actually shares the grounds with this captain, but also with his first wife, who was also named Mary Spalding. Pretty awkward way to spend eternity, if I'm being honest. But hey, welcome to 1800s burial traditions. Apparently in life, this woman was a mother to 7 children, and she was a local healer who focused on curing illness with herbal remedies. But in death, she's of course a folklore figure who was known to manifest as a glowing blue woman who haunts and roams the cemetery, often rising up out of her grave and wandering the grounds. Apparently some claim she also manifests as a pillar of blue light erupting from the grounds, but again, this isn't the ghost story video. We're here to talk about something a bit more, well, tangible. Another well-known story about the cemetery dates back to 1999, when 2 ghost hunters, a mother and child, were ghost hunting here at Vale End. And while doing so, they saw something that was distinctly not blue, or even a lady, and rather this figure rose up from behind the blue lady's grave, scaring the ghost hunters away, and leaving them sort of unsure about their worldview. Seriously, while I feel bad for these 2, the description of how they felt is totally relatable. They were basically like, what is life? Oh my god, are ghosts real? And sort of got depressed. I feel for them. I might also explode if I experienced the supernatural, so we'll see how my ghost hunting escapades go next month. Regardless, just a few weeks later, the mother of this duo was actually found unresponsive in her car, having suffered a heart attack, and leading individuals who knew of her encounter to wonder if someone or something had followed her home from the cemetery. Meanwhile, her daughter, perhaps seeking some sort of vengeance or answers or something in between, returned to the cemetery a year later on the anniversary of their ghost hunt, and on this visit she would again claim that she saw this strange-looking critter. Also, again, I laughed at this in our last video on New Hampshire's ghost, and I'm going to do it again here. So, as if she'd left reality and wandered into a Sesame Street Halloween special, she'd come upon a short, red-looking humanoid that, by her account, was sort of analogous to Elmo, and she approached it. That is, until she slammed into some sort of a, quote, force field, where she couldn't get any closer to the creature. Now, upon hitting this force field, too, apparently more of these little strange red creatures emerged. According to her, all she could do was take photos and leave. And lucky for her, they didn't seem to wish her any harm, but also didn't want her to get any closer. So, some of course interpret this little creature to be a demon, principally because it's red, I suppose, and in common folklore, anything red must come from hell. That said, a few cultured folks out there have put it forward that maybe, just maybe, this red creature that supposedly haunts Vale Cemetery isn't a ghost at all, but is rather a Pukwudgie, akin to those commonly reported in the Bridgewater Triangle of southern Massachusetts. Now, if you don't know what a Pukwudgie is, to put them simply, the Pukwudgie are small forest-dwelling humanoids that stand at about 3 feet in height. Typically, they're reported to walk upright like a small human, and they're typically reported to have gray skin, so I'm not sure about the Elmo-like description in that regard. And they're also sometimes reported to have coarse hair or porcupine-like spines, or sometimes both. And strangely, unlike most cryptids, they actually smell a bit like flowers, so not stinky like Bigfoot. Their names directly translate to Little Wild Man of the Woods that vanishes, or Person of the Wilderness. And when you take in their laundry list of otherworldly powers, this whole force field account by the daughter who visited Vale Cemetery starts to feel a little less outlandish. For instance, not only are these little critters reported by the Algonquin people to be able to turn invisible, shapeshift, and control the human mind, they're also able to transform people that they take from this world into sort of enslaved ghost-like creatures named the Taipei Wonka, something that sort of sits between a fire spirit and a ghostly trap. Very similar to the European will-o'-the-wisp, and they use these captured ghosts to lure in future wilderness goers off the beaten path and into danger, where they can collect you like you collected your favorite Pokemon cards as a young kid. So anyways, my impression is that's about the only Pukwudgie story I've found in New Hampshire, unless you consider the Derry Fairy a Pukwudgie too, which, who knows, they were a little bit similar in size, so maybe you can consider them in this bucket. Anyways, let me know, have you been to Vale Cemetery and seen anything crazy? New Hampshire. Thank you for having me the past couple weeks. From wood devils to faceless creatures at the bottom of your lakes, you're living up to that creepy New England scary stuff in the woods reputation that I appreciate so much about you. Anyways, as always, if you had a good time with this one, let me know. If you don't know, I'm not a full-time YouTuber. But hey, if you like the video, subscribe, comment, and consider hyping this video, and maybe one day that'll change. Otherwise, as for what's next, well, this is the last video before we enter our Season of Spirits, where throughout October, I'll be doing my best to publish at least 6 videos, but hopefully I can put out 2 videos a week where we explore everything from haunted local legends to full-on statewide explorations of haunted places. This will hopefully be my biggest month ever, and it will mean a ton to have you along for the ride. Anyways, with that, thank you all for watching, and with this in mind, whether you just saw your strange, skinny, and maybe a little bit furry neighbor peering out at you from behind a tree, or if you're starting to suspect there's a monkey living in the trees behind your backyard, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.